So in the lead up of the release of Aemeath, Kuro has been dumping a boatload of drip marketing on us in order to hype up what will be the closest equivalent of a sentinel resonator in Lahairoi. I've made some theory videos on Aemeath and Lahairoi already, but the release of the short cinematic Salvation is something I find particularly interesting, because especially as to why Aemeath may be partially invisible or non-existent. So since a lot of people have been wanting me to basically react to some of the trailers, let's get into it.
Time to give your future some thought. What will you do with your lives?
So I think the very first thing we can kind of see here is that Aemeath was once a student. So that puts her existence within a relatively recent time frame. I think there was an NPC or something that did say that Fleet Snowfluff, which her idol or like kind of like singing personality is of, was dated to around 10 years ago. She stopped posting 10 years ago. So this is a really recent thing, and you can probably imagine that she might be related to Rover in some way, the pre-memory wipe Rover, when they were originally a mentor or teacher in Lahairoi.
A space explorer must continue research on the Exostrider. My goal is...
Saving the world!
This is a very good cut, by the way. Just in terms of like editing, this is a very good cut. But this whole thing about saving the world, I think it's like a very silly thing, of course, but that does give you a lot of information about who Aemeath is as a person.
Aemeath, what is this nonsense? Is your future a joke to you? Come back with something serious.
Saving the world? You are impossible.
I find it kind of interesting here, just from an editing perspective, that there's no music in this scene.
It was a joke. Didn't think it'd set off a volcano. Just submit a more thoughtful essay after training. But do you even have something you're passionate about? Me? I just want a happy, carefree life.
And I think that now that we know, considering that she became sort of like the Exostrider's soul, which we went through in our Aemeath video, I think this kind of line is a very ironic one, meant to sort of juxtapose what she eventually becomes. But let's keep on watching. So that kind of like whole thing about the paper becomes an overarching motif. Very interesting.
Now, time for training.
I do need to translate some of these as well. I have translated something in advance, but I do need to translate some of these.
Aemeath, if you weren't a synchronist, anywhere you'd want to go? Oh, everywhere.
And the music starts now, which is a very interesting choice in terms of editing and choreography.
There are so many places I want to visit, people I want to see.
I think one thing as well is that some people have mentioned that her tacit mark has 5 bands, which is something that does change when she merges and becomes one of the Exostrider, but let's keep on watching for now.
And you? Huh? Comms are down. Is this a new training drill?
I want to actually kind of go back to this a little bit. I'm going to talk about this a little bit later, but this is Lahairoi, right? You can kind of see on the screen this is Lahairoi. This is kind of like the Solace trees and whatnot. There's like some Exostrider components, but it looks like Lahairoi. That's what I thought when I first saw this picture. But I'm going to go through later in the video and actually talk about why this whole world seems very interesting and why I think this actually isn't specifically Lahairoi, or at least not the Lahairoi that we know of as of present.
Is this a new training drill?
So another interesting thing here is that the synchronous pilot cockpit, which we know exists because you can actually visit it on the map, is synchronizing not actually with the Exostrider fully, but with a sort of small mech. So this almost looks like Hyvatia, or maybe, for example, the Mecha Scout that is within Aemeath's trailer. And I think that we do notice because if I recall correctly, in the Star Torch Academy lore, Scott Rebel did say that merging, like resonating with the Exostrider did not necessarily mean resonating with the larger body itself, but with its creations as well. So this whole idea about kind of merging with this smaller mech actually does make a lot of sense, and we know from Aemeath's combat animations, of course, that that's eventually what does happen. So this whole idea that eventually she does merge with the actual Exostrider is something that's very interesting. And I'm gonna kind of talk about this later, but this whole disaster scene, right? I want you guys to kind of pay attention to this, because does this look like any point in Lahairoi? This is one of the really interesting parts I found in this trailer, is this sort of simulation that Aemeath is running through. This does not look like any part of Lahairoi that we know of, right? There's nothing in the map that has been so open, so flat. There's nothing, for example, about like something like this canyon, right? And the other thing as well, this disaster that the people are running from, the ground splitting open, right?
Is the objective to save these people?
This whole idea of the ground splitting open, this doesn't actually make sense, right? And the reason why the ground splitting open is kind of like tectonic activity doesn't make sense is that in Lahairoi, if you read the Etching Plains lore, there is actually a certain thing called subcrust spines, and they're basically exostrider creations. You can see them all around the map. They're basically these things, right? And their job is to keep the tectonic activity within Lahairoi stable. So the fact that in the map here, there's none of these things, and instead, the ground is splitting open, suggests to me that this isn't Lahairoi, right? And you can also see on the map these things, they're called solistries. You can see them in Beata Woods. And yes, these are the same solistries that you find on the map of Lahairoi, but very clearly, this scene is not the Beata Woods. The only place in Lahairoi that has solistries are the Beata Woods. In the Beata Woods, there's no houses like this, there's no tree, well, there are trees like this, but there should be like, kind of like Exostrider fauna and stuff like that, right? There's no Exostrider animals, there's no Exostrider plants, which should be in the same kind of like frame as these objects that we are familiar with, right? We do know these houses, these kind of like tents do exist, but besides that, this is a very unsettling scene, not just because of what's happening, but the fact that this is very unfamiliar. This isn't Lahairoi, right? And I want you guys to keep watching. Keep that thought in mind while you keep watching.
Piece of cake.
And I want you to see like this very important scene, right? When Aemeath is trying to save this person falling down, she phases through them, right? Why does she phase through this person? In almost a similar way that she phases through and can't really interact with anyone else in the present. And this is going to be my main theory, right? That I'm going to be pushing for the rest of this video, is that this whole scene in Lahairoi, and the reason why she phases through and can't touch this person, is because this whole scene in Lahairoi of, like, for example, this disaster that is happening, if I can actually go back to it. Come on. Yeah, this whole disaster scene, we already talked about how this isn't Lahairoi, but what really makes sense to me, I think, is that this is actually the past, right? This is not Lahairoi, but actually the Frostlands that we know used to be fertile, used to be livable before the surface froze over, right? We know that the Royans call the event that froze the surface the Great Glacial Lock. So what I'm actually imagining is that this environment with open plains, with the Royan architecture, with stuff, with a complete lack, by the way, of Exostrider animals and plants, seems to be instead the past of what the Royan Frostlands used to look like before they froze over. And the reason why Aemeath can't actually sort of interact with this person and basically, like, you know, save them, right, is because this person is a simulation of the past. They are not real, right? And I want you to kind of carry this idea with you going forward.
Why am I passing straight through?
And this kind of like disaster scenario where everything's blowing up and stuff like that, I don't actually think is sort of like a trailer for what is going to happen in 3.1. As I said before, I think this is really what happened in the past, right? Because we know from Royan history, from the game lore that we have, the map lore, that there was some sort of disaster that pushed the Royans underground. And this whole conception that Havenrunga, the Great Glacial Lock happened, and the whole surface kind of like went to shit basically, and the ruins are forced underground, makes kind of a lot of sense, right? Because this seems like a disaster scenario of what happened historically, not what is going to happen. This is a past memory. And you can see again the people, right? It's not just the person Aemeath is trying to save. People who are running are completely phasing through her. And she says, like, this isn't a sim. It's not a sim. It's a past memory, right? Void matter is surging. If you guys remember, during the second, I think it was the beginning of the second epoch in Royan history that we actually talked about in the third epoch video, what really happened during the second epoch was the Frenodian LF1 or Virunga actually started wreaking havoc, right? Which is why void matter is surging, because this is when the underground calamity of Virunga started plaguing Lahairoi. And we even kind of got some clues as to that in Act 2 of 3.0 when we talked to the Shaper in the Solaceum, when they gave us that sort of like a history lesson of how Virunga came along. It was an underground threat, sleeping kind of like underground, and when the Great Glacial Lock happened, it awoke and started screwing shit up, right? So void matter surging here actually kind of makes a lot of sense, because this is a replay of the disaster.
Matter surging. Need to get everyone out.
I actually need to translate that, but I'm not too sure what that means. I'll need to translate in a second. But yeah, again, disaster situation. This is what I want you guys to look at, because this is the one thing I did translate before this video, right? What actually this button like kind of like means, and why I translated because it was focused on so heavily, is sync rate limiter. What that seems to suggest to me is that the synchronous cockpit has a failsafe to prevent synchronous from syncing too heavily with the Exostrider and its creations. So as soon as you press this button, which Aemeath does, spoiler alert, she does, in a couple of seconds, is that actually removes the failsafe from the synchronous completely merging of the Exostrider, which is what I think Aemeath actually does, right? And I'll talk about this in more detail later, but when she fully syncs of the Exostrider, I think what actually happens is that she doesn't really disappear in a sense, but a portion of her being actually moves into the scene of the simulation that's happening in the past, basically, right?
There's no other way.
So cockpit frequency, as we know before, in order to resonate with the Exostrider, you need to kind of like match the frequency, right? So what she's doing is like critically dangerous, of course, because she's basically merging her entire being and existence, because we know that's what frequencies are in Wuthering Waves, right? She's merging her whole existence in part with the Exostrider. She's going past safe limits.
Exostrider, you've slept long enough. Now, it's time to wake up! I may not...
And the fact that the Exostrider is kind of like, she was able to force her to wake up, suggests to me, of course, and we know this from existing evidence that says Aemeath was a great synchronist, that she was able to actually connect with the Exostrider. So what you may be seeing here is, as we said before, like possibly like a real memory, right? Like these disasters that happened that Aemeath is like running through this current simulation in the video seem to be a real memory that either the Exostrider or its creations actually went through.
Now, you will listen to...
And this whole thing on the screen, right? I'll just actually pause at the correct points. This whole thing on the screen seems to suggest to me that how it keeps on hovering between 98 and 99% suggests to me that basically Aemeath is nearly giving up her entire being. This is probably the synchronization rate, right? I would not be surprised if this directly translates to synchronization rate. I actually think it does, because I do recognize that this is a SY character, right? Actually, no, I do think it's a synchronization rate, because that's an R, that's an A. Yeah, it's synchronization. It means synchronization rate, right? Based on what I remember from Lahairoi script. So the fact that her synchronization rate is nearly 100% suggests to me that she is able to basically fully connect with the Exostrider. And what happens when you fully connect the Exostrider? You start actually just inducing its memories, right? Its past memories.
Listen to my command!
And that's why, of course, she goes into the white room, the rubber room of rats, right? Because she reaches essentially 99.9 or 100% synchronization rate. And that's why, of course, the Exostrider wakes up. And this whole scene, right? This is Lahairoi, by the way. This is the central square of Lahairoi. I think this whole kind of scene where basically everything dissolves is almost symbolic or representative of the present world evaporating, right? As Aemeath kind of like almost ascends to a new dimension. Because as you can see here, why are there 3 like blue balls or like 4 blue balls in the sky? Probably seems to be almost like elements of void or something. But beyond that, as we said before, I think part of Aemeath's being, when it merges the Exostrider, actually moves into the past, because that's what really kind of like, that's the only thing that really makes sense. Why does she go through a past memory sequence if not for the fact that she actually does move into the past? And this, of course, like you can kind of see here, the world is shattering. You can see that these buildings are, of course, not really something you see in Lahairoi, right? They're almost something you would see, for example, within Shorekeeper's lament memory of the port city of Guishu. And you can kind of see here, this tower extends really high. And when I first saw this, I was like, this is emblematic of the Tower of Babel, right? And God kind of like crashing through the heavens to destroy it, to punish humanity for their ambitions, which, as you probably know, is a very overambition, is a very big theme of Lahairoi's kind of like design language. But besides that, I think this whole thing about the sky cracking is almost like this idea of like the lament, right? Usually, I think there's a very similar scene in Shorekeeper's trailer where there was a resonant, like kind of like tacit mark appearing in the sky to sort of symbolize this idea of like how this overworldly divine force is like wreaking destruction on humanity. And of course, this sort of, as I said before, this is a memory sequence, right? A memory sequence of disaster. I remember very clearly in the beginning of this episode somewhere that she says it almost like, it kind of like blew up like a volcano or something, like something over here. It was a joke. I didn't think it would set off a volcano, which is a very good, like kind of like nice touch. But this idea of like how that kind of comes back to bite almost later on with the volcano sequence, right? Seems to kind of like suggest to me this is a disaster sequence from the past. It's a past memory of when like really Lahairoi was kind of destroyed. Or when the global laments kind of happened, maybe when Lahairoi's magnetic axis shift, possibly. A lot of like possible kind of like ideas of that. And this sort of like tidal wave of ice, this is very much Lahairoi, right? And the fact that this kind of like really is quite obviously the Great Glacial Lock, which is something we know because if I recall correctly, in one of like the cinematics for Aemeath's song from like Fleet Snowfluff, you actually see the Exostrider slumbering beneath kind of like one of these like ice arches, which I'll post when I'm editing the video, of course. But it seems to suggest to me again, this is a memory sequence. This is the past. And the fact that she's so like kind of like stunned, you know, from seeing all of that seems to again suggest that she went through an otherworldly experience where she is no longer like fully like herself in the present.
What was that? Why won't it respond? Move! Just move!
And you can kind of see here, right? This is the Exostrider. This is like the very first clear shot we have of the Exostrider within the Royan Frostlands. And you can kind of see over here, it is very clearly not moving because it's inactive, right? The reactor drive was taken away from it. It can't move. It is unable to operate from what we know in Royan history. So later on in the video, I'm going to kind of like justify why exactly it starts moving again, right?
There's no time left. Damn it!
And you can kind of see here when she says there's no time left, she's almost trying to save or like kind of change something that has already happened. Because if this whole memory sequence of like what she's trying to kind of save is really the past, then it's already set in stone. Fate has already been set in stone, which is a very common topic with Wuthering Waves, as you probably know. And that, I think, is also kind of emphasized by sort of like what you see from the paper planes within the song description, I think it was, within Aemeath's song, that fate is changed and set in stone. She's doomed to fail this kind of simulation or past memory, as you call it, but she's going to try anyway.
Damn it! Move! Move already! I said move!
And this whole memory sequence, how there's this like very calming music that begins playing to juxtapose the tense moment beforehand, with this memory sequence of like her party, like her like school life, seems to kind of suggest to me that this is symbolically what she has to give up in order to save the people, in order to kind of like try to fight back against fate, right? This memory sequence juxtaposing the past memory sequence kind of like over here, the volcano, the lament, the ice wave, seems to suggest this is the past against the present. Like this memory sequence, right? It seems to suggest basically saying that Aemeath had a life, right? She was a person before she disappeared and gave up her existence. And my only wish for you is that you live a happy life, again, is something that I feel like is going to be very important later on, but I can't definitively say what exactly this links to, because there's so many different options and ways you can kind of interpret this. So I'll hold off on interpreting this for now and wait for, of course, 3.1 to come out.
I refuse.
And of course, like the use of like kind of like music, right? How there was a very short calming memory sequence and it immediately kind of like shifts to, again, a scene with no music except for just the voice acting.
To let the void take my future.
To let the void take my future seems to suggest to me, of course, that she is somewhat aware that she's giving up her existence, right? So I think that perhaps the fact that she is not fully able to exist in the present world may be a combination of some sort of like void mechanic, as well as also the fact that she's also going into the past. And it's going to be something, a scene after this, to kind of like lends further credence to that. So let's keep watching.
My future. I will protect everything we have.
And of course, like as I said, the motif of like the worksheet, right, appears again, right? It's very clever use of this symbolism.
Saving the world.
And again, like the memory sequence of the past, right, juxtaposed with the present that she just went through, kind of like over here, right? It's all about juxtaposition, past and present. And of course, as you can probably see here, we already know she has 6 tacit marks, but yeah. And how like she merges with the Exostrider and becomes like semi-ethereal, doesn't really exist in the world anymore. We'll talk a bit about that afterwards. And how she basically kind of exists in a void-like space seems to suggest to me a couple of things, right? The first thing, of course, is that she's merged with the Exostrider now. We already saw that her synchronization rate was basically 98, 99%, so we can assume that she broke through and reached 100. So she's with basically the Exostrider now, and the Exostrider seems to have some sort of capacity to, one, navigate in the void, and also kind of retain memory of the past, and possibly even maneuver in some sort of like time or space-time kind of like dimension, right? The reason why I do say that is because in the previous Monia video, I already went through that space-time and this whole kind of idea of, like, for example, time dilation has already been referenced within the design language of Wuthering Waves. So I wouldn't be too surprised if Virunga, the Frenodian, as well as the Void, considering that there's been a very heavy implication within, I think, the Rebirth Uplands lore that there is some sort of portal to space underneath Lahairoi, beyond the Strider Gate, that she is kind of like bending some sort of space-time to essentially exist both in the past and the present. This kind of juxtaposition of the past and present that has been going on throughout this whole video seems to kind of collude to that fact. And there's one more thing that will happen that kind of will lend, again, further credence to that. So let's keep watching. And it's this thing, right? Why is the Exostrider moving? We know in the present time, the Exostrider is completely incapable of moving. It can't even be turned on, right? Because its reactor drive is in the sky. It should not be active at all. So the fact that it is active within this sort of void space, or maybe even, for example, this kind of like warped or distorted space-time, seems to suggest that in order to kind of clock out the Exostrider's powers, because I do think this is some sort of manifestation of the Exostrider to some degree, what might possibly have to happen is that Aemeath, as kind of like the soul or the seal of the Exostrider, needs to kind of almost go to the past, in a sense, to summon the Exostrider during its glory days or when it had maximum power in order to combat its their enemies or the Frenodian, right? It's possible that the Exostrider does have this power to kind of maneuver in this void, in this space-time. We saw that already with Aemeath during the beginning of Act 1 of 3.0. So there seems to be some sort of power to bend time almost, to go to the past as well as the present. Otherwise, Aemeath wouldn't have been even brought into this sort of like simulation at the beginning of this video to begin with, right? This wouldn't have happened if the Exostrider or her did not have some sort of paracausal or like time distorting ability. Again, right? Like, there's no way the Exostrider is just cooked if she's fighting and it is moving, right? Because currently we know right now the Exostrider is definitely not moving, and the reactor drive currently is sitting in Fangspire Chasm after it fell out of the sky. So perhaps we will recover, like the Exostrider will recover its drive. But until then, the only way Aemeath can really, like summon the Exostrider's power is to perhaps go into the past before it lost the reactor drive, before it kind of like was injured with its fight with Virunga that we know from Royan history. And the other thing, a point of contention I have, that this Exostrider is not really sort of like real in a sense, and kind of like a manifestation of like the past or whatnot, is that I want you guys to look at kind of like the scene. The Exostrider looks really small, right? I'm assuming that the things that it's fighting are kind of like high. That's like the twin blade Novas, right? That the Academy builds out of Exostrider material. But in relation to those, this Exostrider is really small. And we know the Exostrider is much more massive than this because its sword, called Sundamir, which we know is this, right? Like, this is Sundamir, based on what we can see from the world, is at least 500 meters long, based on the details we can see from the Space Trek Observatory. And we know from the size of its reactor drive that is currently in Fangspire Chasm. You can walk around it. It's massive. The Exostrider is a enormous kind of like beast, robot, right? So this whole thing seems to be a manifestation of it, perhaps a vision or like some sort of version of it that exists within space-time, within the void. But it is not the real Exostrider. The real Exostrider seems to be slumbering in the middle of the Roy and Frostons right now. That has not changed. And what is really fighting here in the void seems to be kind of like a smaller manifestation of it. That's the only way I can really justify how small it is currently within the scene. And the fact that it has wings, right, like the enormous shoulder blades that we saw ended up being wings, seems to suggest, again, like it's something that was designed to fight in this dimension of like space or space-time or whatever void dimension the Frenodian LF1 seems to inhabit. But again, you can see from all of the visuals here, it just seems way too small. That's a bit consistent issue that I have. And I want you to also kind of see here, because this is one of the clearest shots you're going to get of its sword. This sword, right, is very consistent with what we kind of see with not only Aemeath's like combat animations, but also like the top of the sword here is exactly what Sundamir looks like, right? If you go onto the map and check out Sundamir, the Exostrider's sword in Lahairoi, that's what it looks like. That's the design. So this is the Exostrider, but it's at the same time not a real or like whole physical manifestation of it. And again, that's a void worm. Void worms are pretty massive, as we saw from Act 1 of 3.0. But the Exostrider and Aemeath seem to be almost of a comparable size to it, which seems to suggest this is almost like a kind of like memory sequence in itself. Or actually just had another thought. Perhaps this is, for example, where the Strider Gate is underneath Lahairoi. She's probably been, for example, fighting here to keep the Frenodian in check. Almost like Cardophia within the Inverted Tower was keeping the keeping Leviathan at bay, right? Because we do know from a lot of the map lore that the Strider Gate is kind of like close to breaking, right? It is under siege and it is not going to last forever. So maybe this is, for example, a almost creative interpretation of what is constantly happening with the Strider Gate, with the Frenodian trying to break out of its prison in a sense, and Aemeath, as he saw the Exostrider, consistently working to prevent that happening. And this cool high kind of like scene, again, how it kind of switches between Aemeath in a flash scene and the Exostrider with the sword seems to suggest again that they've completely merged, they've completely synchronized. And I want to kind of point your attention here as well. This sort of scene, right? Does this scene not, this kind of like ground that they're piercing through, not seem very similar to the kind of like terrain that we went through in the beginning of sort of like the trailer? This whole flat ground with like kind of like some like ground disturbances and they're piercing through the void, right? Sorry, not the void, like a canyon or some sort of ravine seems to be very similar to kind of like what was gone through in the beginning memory sequence here, right? When the ground split open. So again, it leans to this idea that there's sort of like this blending between the past and the present that is happening not just within the trailer, but perhaps also within the Exostrider and as such Aemeath's existence herself. And that's the trailer.
It worked.
Again, constant motif of the worksheet. And it's also seen here now she can't really pick it up, right? And we already know that Aemeath kind of like phases through things, doesn't really exist wholly, like is not fully corporeal within the present world. And even though we don't know the full answer for this, we know she's fully merged with the Exostrider. That may be a reason. But I also think that in order to bring out the Exostrider's power, as we talked about in the previous points of this video, she needs to essentially put like a portion of herself or her existence within space-time or within the past to truly be able to activate the Exostrider's powers, because otherwise she can't really physically activate the Exostrider. It's frozen right now above the Royan Frostlands. It has its heart taken out. It can't move, right? So maybe to summon a manifestation of the Exostrider within like this combat scene, she actually needs to position a portion of herself in the past. That's my theory, at least. And this, of course, is a short scene of basically her life as we know it in the current present time when Rover, the second version of Rover, comes to Lahairoi.
His magic was snowflakes clean.
And again, the song lyrics. I think this was Fleet Snowfluff. She has a song for this specifically, but again, snowflakes, a lot of references to paper planes, how paper planes eventually have to fall. Again, trying to fight back against a fate that is impossible to change.
White powder stardust on your skin, glistening.
And of course, this is Helios, right?
Moments may be fleeting.
What's also very interesting is that she seems to be able to kind of like pull out some sort of terminal here. That might be part of the Exostrider, or she, like Monya, has some sort of electrical interference that she can kind of like use or manipulate.
Pretend, but through your voyage, they will sing, soaring like the.
And again, paper planes was such a big motif in the song that was released alongside this, because paper planes symbolically are something that can fly and soar very high, but are doomed to like eventually fall. And I like this lyric particularly, coasting for trails we pave, again seems to suggest with the paper planes that we talked about at the beginning, like early in the video, that the fact that the paper planes symbolize a fate that is doomed to fail almost links up with this kind of idea of the past memory sequence being something that you can't change because it's already happened. And again, carrying the torch, very symbolic of like, basically championing the human spirit and like preserving the fire almost, spreading the wings. I think I don't really need to say much about that. There's been a lot of references to Icarus and that kind of myth of overambition in the story. I've talked about it a lot. And this whole idea of like being an ever-guiding light, pretty common as well, right? Because Monya referenced it within her song, but being a light within the void of darkness seems to be another kind of symbolic element that is popping up a lot within Lahairoi's design language.
Say hello to our new classmate.
And of course, we saw this scene already within the 3.0 kind of like trailer, but it makes a lot more sense when you put it into perspective, right? Because Rover being able to kind of see her as a kind of divine being themselves makes a lot of sense, right? Perhaps Rover is kind of like also trapped in some sort of like space-time loop, and that's why he or she can perceive their presence, basically. And yeah, that's really kind of like the end of the trailer. It was a really interesting trailer, I think. It reveals a lot about what's going to come up with 3.1. I do understand that probably this is going to change with the live stream, 3.1 live stream perhaps, but we'll see how that kind of turns out later. So as always, if you enjoyed the video, feel free to support me, maybe just like add in your comments as well if you had any thoughts. But until then, I'll be hopefully seeing you guys in 3.1.